Mitchell grabbed the manifest read it once and laughed so hard the room stopped talking. "Ghost Rider!" He said it like a punchline. They gave the air show girl a call sign. He threw the clipboard onto the table. "Listen, sweetheart, fly your little museum piece wave to the crowd and stay out of our airspace. Leave the actual flying to the men who do this for real." Every pilot in that briefing room laughed. Emily Carter didn't move, didn't blink, didn't say a single word. She just looked at him with the quiet patience of someone who had already survived things he couldn't imagine, and waited for the sky to answer for her. If this is your first time here, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment with your city. I want to see exactly how far Ghost Rider flies. The briefing room at Falcon Ridge Air Base had a particular kind of energy on the morning of the Silver Horizon Air Festival. It was the energy of men who believed they had already won something before the competition began. Pilots who flew the newest generation of combat aircraft had a way of moving through a room like they owned the oxygen inside it, and Captain Ryan Mitchell moved through rooms better than anyone. He was 31 years old. He had a jaw that looked carved from something expensive and a confidence that had never once been tested hard enough to crack. His flight record was genuine, nobody disputed that. 3 commendations, 2 international demonstration awards, a personal best on the tactical course that still stood at Falcon Ridge. He had earned the right to walk through rooms the way he did. That was the problem. He had earned it young. And earning things young before you understand what earning actually costs has a way of making a man believe the earning was easy, that everyone around him simply hadn't tried hard enough. Emily Carter walked into the briefing room at 7:42 in the morning, and nobody noticed her for almost 4 minutes. That was not unusual. Emily had spent the better part of 2 decades cultivating the specific skill of being unnoticed. She wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a simple blue jacket, aviator sunglasses pushed up on her forehead. She carried a leather flight bag that was old enough to have creases worn into the handle from 1,000 different grips. She moved quietly along the wall, found a chair in the far corner, set her bag down without a sound, and sat. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't reach for coffee. She simply opened a small notebook and began reading whatever she had written in it the night before. Captain Tyler Brooks Mitchell's wingman and closest friend on the base was the first to notice her. He leaned toward Mitchell and said quietly, "Who's the civilian?" Mitchell glanced over. He studied Emily for about 2 seconds. "Some vintage demonstration pilot," he said. "There's always one at these things. They pull out some old bird, and somebody's grandmother flies it around for the nostalgia crowd. She doesn't look like somebody's grandmother. She's not exactly active duty either." The observation wasn't wrong. Emily was 38 years old, and she carried those years the way certain people do, not hidden, not apologized for, just present. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that didn't come from a desk job. There was something in the way she sat that suggested a person who had spent more hours in a cockpit than in a chair. But Mitchell had already made his decision about her, and Captain Ryan Mitchell was not a man who revisited decisions. Major Gerald Harlan entered the briefing room at 7:50 on the dot. He was the demonstration coordinator for the festival, a career officer with the kind of permanent tiredness behind his eyes that comes from managing events with too many moving parts and too many pilots with too much ego. He dropped a stack of folders on the table, took his coffee from under his arm, and looked around the room. His gaze stopped on Emily. Something changed in his face. It was subtle, just a slight adjustment, a kind of careful attention that hadn't been there a moment before. He walked over to her, directly extending his hand. "Major Harlan, I want to make sure you have everything you need." Emily stood and shook his hand. "I'm good, Major. Thank you." "Your aircraft has been prepped. Crew Chief is Martinez Best on the flight line. He'll have questions for you about your preferences." "I'll find him after the brief." Harlan nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else. He didn't. Mitchell watched the exchange with mild curiosity. The coordinator didn't usually make personal introductions to visiting performers. He filed that observation away without knowing what to do with it yet. The briefing began. Harlan ran through the scheduled takeoff windows, altitude restrictions, crowd positioning, emergency protocols. The senior pilots went first in the demonstration order, with Mitchell anchoring the finale. The vintage demonstration slot was second to last. One of the newer pilots, Lieutenant Danny Reyes, read that aloud from the schedule and raised an eyebrow. Second to last. We've got a museum piece right before Mitchell's finale. The schedule is set, Harlan said flatly. I'm just saying going from a restored Sabre to a fifth-generation fighter is a big tonal shift. Then the finale will feel even more impressive. Moving on. Reyes shrugged and leaned back. Mitchell said nothing, but he smiled slightly. The implication was clear enough. He would close the show, and whatever came before him would simply be prologue. After the briefing, pilots filtered out toward the flight line. Mitchell stopped to talk to Brooks, running through their formation timing. He was mid-sentence when the clipboard from the operations desk caught his eye. He picked it up without thinking. He was looking for his own slot confirmation. His eyes drifted across the manifest, and he stopped. He read the name a second time. Then he laughed. It started as a short sound, sharp and disbelieving, and then it expanded into something he made no effort to contain. Brooks, come look at this. Brooks leaned over. His expression stayed neutral. What am I looking at? Flight manifest, second to last slot. Mitchell tapped the clipboard. Emily Carter, age 38. Aircraft F-86 Sabre restored. He paused for effect. Call sign listed as Ghostwriter. Brooks' neutral expression held for a moment too long. Then, where does it list the call sign? Right here, emergency identification field. Mitchell shook his head, still smiling. Somebody's got a sense of humor. Ghostwriter. That's not a call sign, that's a Halloween costume. The two pilots nearby, Reyes and Captain Sasha Volk, who flew second in the afternoon slot, both turned at the laughter. What's funny? Reyes asked. Our vintage performer has a call sign, Ghostwriter. Mitchell set the clipboard down. I'm going to go introduce myself. Give her some professional advice. Keep the old bird in the air and let the real pilots handle the impressive stuff. He walked back into the operations area. Emily was still in the corner now, standing and reviewing a weather printout she'd gotten from somewhere. She had one hand in her jacket pocket, and she was reading with a focused stillness that was almost meditative. Mitchell approached at full stride the way he approached everything. Emily Carter. He said it like a question, but it wasn't really a question. She looked up. Her expression was patient. Captain Ryan Mitchell, I fly the F-22 finale slot. He extended his hand. Welcome to Falcon Ridge. Thank you. She shook his hand once cleanly. I wanted to introduce myself. And to offer, he paused with calculated generosity, anything you might need for your slot. We want you to feel comfortable up there. Emily studied him for a moment. The way she looked at him wasn't hostile. It wasn't warm either. It was the specific look of someone who had seen this exact presentation before and was simply waiting for it to finish. I'm comfortable, she said. The Sabre's a beautiful aircraft, challenging systems. A lot of pilots underestimate how physical it gets when you push the envelope on older platforms. It gets physical, she agreed. If you want to observe my pre-flight checks, I'm happy to walk you through the process. Modern systems have a lot to teach. Captain. Her voice was quiet, but it had a weight to it that stopped him. I appreciate that. I'll be fine. Something in her tone landed differently than he expected. He covered it with another smile. Of course. I just like to look out for the civilian performers. It's part of what we do here. I know what you do here, Emily said. She turned back to her weather printout. Mitchell held the smile for a second longer than it was comfortable, then walked back to where Brooks was standing. Friendly, Brooks said. She'll be fine once she sees what the modern birds can do. She'll understand the context. Brooks didn't respond to that. What Mitchell didn't see, because he had already looked away, was the slight change in Emily's expression when he left. Not anger, not hurt. Something quieter and more measured, like a person adding a piece of information to a mental file they had been keeping for a long time. Martinez, the crew chief, found Emily at the Sabres hardstand at 8:45. He was 44 years old and had been working on aircraft for 22 of those years. He had the hands of someone who had taken apart and reassembled more engines than he could count, and the eyes of someone who took his work personally. He'd been assigned to the vintage aircraft as something of a professional compliment. His supervisor trusted him to make sure the restored bird was airworthy, without margin for error. He introduced himself with a handshake that was firm without performing. "I went over her twice last night," he said, "and once this morning. She's clean. But I want to walk you through anything that concerns you before you make any decisions about your profile." Emily put her hand flat on the aircraft's fuselage. She was quiet for a moment. "How's the left stabilizer feel to you?" she asked. Martinez frowned slightly. "It's within spec." "I know it's within spec. How does it feel?" He considered. He thought about the maintenance report. He thought about his own hands on that surface the night before. "Slightly stiffer than I'd expect at this temperature. Nothing that would flag." "I noticed it when I sat in the cockpit earlier." She ran her hand along the surface slowly. "It's not going to cause problems at cruise. But if I go into sustained G at the top of a climb, I want to know I have full deflection response." Martinez stared at her for a moment. "You're planning a sustained G maneuver at the top of a climb. I'm planning to fly this aircraft as it was designed to be flown. I just want to know what I'm working with." There was a pause. Martinez looked at the stabilizer, then back at her. "Give me 40 minutes, he said. "I'll recheck the actuator assembly." "Thank you, Sergeant." He started walking toward the tool bay, then stopped and turned back. There was a question on his face that had nothing to do with the actuator. "You've flown this airframe before." It wasn't a question. Emily looked at him steadily. "A few times," she said. Martinez held her gaze for a second. Something passed through his expression, not quite recognition, but the beginning of it, like a man who had heard a piece of music once before a long time ago and couldn't place where. He went to get his tools. The other demonstration pilots cycled through their pre-flight checks with the organized efficiency of people who had done the routine so many times it had become physical memory. Mitchell ran his with the particular precision of someone who knew he was being observed and didn't mind. He spoke his checks aloud loudly enough that the ground crew heard each step, and twice he caught himself standing in profile against the aircraft in a way that looked slightly rehearsed. Lieutenant Reyes, 26 years old and flying the third slot, was running his own checks nearby. He was a good pilot, genuinely gifted with instincts that his instructors had already marked as exceptional, but he was also 26, which meant he had been flying for the idea of himself as a pilot, almost as long as he'd been flying aircraft. He walked past the Sabres hardstand and stopped when he saw Emily on her knees beside the landing gear, her hands inside the wheel assembly. "Is your crew chief not handling that?" he asked. "He is," Emily said without looking up. "I'm looking at something separately." Reyes crouched down to see what she was examining. He frowned. "The brake assembly looks fine." "It is fine." She stood and wiped her hands. "I just like to know where my weight is going when I land." "That's in the pre-flight data. Data tells you where the weight is supposed to go. Your hands tell you where it's actually going." Reyes studied her. He had the slightly combative curiosity of a young person who can't decide whether the older person in front of them is wise or simply stubborn. "You've been doing this a long time," he asked. "Long enough." "What kind of aircraft have you flown?" Emily looked at him. There was something in her expression that might have been a decision being made. "Various types," she said. "Jet turboprop. What's your primary?" "Jet." "Current type rating." She paused for exactly 1 second. "Several." Reyes narrowed his eyes. "What does several mean?" "It means several lieutenant." He blinked at the rank acknowledgement. She hadn't been introduced to him, hadn't asked his name, had apparently identified his rank from context or insignia without making a production of it. He stood up straighter without meaning to. I'm just trying to understand your background, he said. I know. Emily picked up her flight bag. I appreciate the curiosity. Focus on your own pre-flight. You had a slight lean in your walk that suggests your left boot is rubbing. Long flight days in an uncomfortable boot become a distraction. You should deal with it before your slot. Reyes stared at her. She walked toward the operations building. He looked down at his left boot. He didn't say anything to anyone about the exchange, but he watched her differently after that. Sam. The first real break in the morning routine came at 10:15, 90 minutes before the demonstration was scheduled to begin. A technical issue grounded one of the support aircraft, a training variant that was supposed to fly a coordination pattern during the opening sequence. The operations team scrambled to adjust the schedule, and for 20 minutes, the briefing room filled with the particular controlled chaos of military planning in real time. Major Harlan managed the noise with the practiced calm of someone who had managed worse. He redistributed timing slots, adjusted the crowd announcement sequence, and made 3 phone calls in under 5 minutes. In the middle of this, one of the younger ground crew members, Airman First Class Torres, barely 20, with the wide eyes of someone still calibrating how much was normal in this environment, knocked over a coffee mug directly onto the secondary manifest stack on the operations desk. The paper was salvageable. The incident was minor. What mattered was that in the process of blotting and sorting, the full flight manifest came open on the desk. The complete one with the detailed identification fields, and it sat there visible for about 2 minutes, while Torres mopped up and Harlan's back was turned. Sergeant Major Cole Bennett walked past the desk at that moment. He was 53 years old. He had been in military aviation for 31 years. First as a fighter crew technician, later as a senior aircraft systems specialist, now in an advisory role that meant he traveled to major demonstrations and looked at things with eyes that had seen enough to make him valuable. He had a way of walking through a room that gave nothing away. He neither rushed nor dawdled, neither advertised his attention nor hid it. He glanced at the open manifest as he passed. His feet stopped. He looked at the manifest for a long moment. His face didn't change dramatically. It wasn't the kind of face that did. But something happened behind his eyes. Something that looked to anyone watching closely enough like a man walking into a room he had been in once before and recognizing the furniture. He looked at the name, Emily Carter. He looked at the call sign in the emergency identification field, Ghostwriter. His jaw tightened once, then released. He looked up and scanned the room. He found Emily across the space sitting with her notebook again, apparently unmoved by the surrounding chaos. He watched her for a moment. He didn't approach her. He simply stood where he was for 3 or 4 seconds longer than made sense for a man just walking through a room, then continued on his way. But before he left the building, he stopped one of the senior ground crew members, a technical sergeant he'd worked with on 3 different bases over 15 years. The vintage performer, Bennett said quietly. Emily Carter. How long has she been in the schedule? The sergeant checked his tablet. Added 4 days ago, last-minute slot. Came in through the Regional Aviation Association. Her credentials checked out through the FAA, but Major Harlan also made a separate call to someone above base level. Above base level? That's what I was told. Bennett was quiet for a moment. Who confirmed the slot? Authorization came from Group Level Sergeant Major. I don't have the specific name. Bennett nodded slowly. Thank you. He walked outside. He stood beside the building for a moment. The sounds of the flight line around him, aircraft engines being turned over, the distant rhythm of a ground crew working. His face alone now showed something more. Not shock. Something older than shock. The specific recognition of a man who had once owed his life to someone, had spent years wondering what became of that person, and was now standing on the edge of an answer he hadn't expected to find here at a festival on a Tuesday morning. He pressed his lips together and walked toward the flight line. At 11 o'clock, 1 hour before the gates opened to the public, Mitchell gathered his wingmen for a final coordination review beside his aircraft. The machine was extraordinary. That wasn't performance or projection, it was simply true. The fifth-generation fighter represented the absolute apex of what military aviation had achieved in the past 2 decades. Every system on board was more capable than the human pilot it served. In many ways, the pilot existed primarily to authorize decisions the aircraft's computer had already made. Mitchell had opinions about that, but they were nuanced opinions, and he kept them for conversations that warranted nuance. In front of his team, his job was confidence. "We're second to last in launch, first in impact," he told them. "The crowd gets vintage first, and we get the finale. We use that to our advantage. Let them feel nostalgic. Let them get comfortable. Then we remind them what a military aircraft actually looks like when there are no restrictions." Brooks, standing at the edge of the group, looked across the flight line toward the Sabre. Emily was sitting on the aircraft's wing. This was unusual enough that Brooks looked twice. Sitting on the wing of an aircraft you're about to fly, not for maintenance, not for inspection, just sitting, was the kind of thing you almost never saw. It looked from a distance like a person saying something private to a machine, or like a person listening for something. Brooks watched her for a moment. She wasn't moving. Her head was slightly bowed. Her hands were flat on the metal on either side of her. "Brooks," Mitchell's voice. "You with us?" "Yeah." He turned back. "I'm with you." He didn't say anything about what he'd seen. At 11:22, Airman Torres, still recovering from the coffee incident and the mild public embarrassment that followed, was delivering updated weather printouts to the pilots. He was working quickly, head down, moving through the briefing area with the focused efficiency of someone trying to be invisible. He stopped at Emily's chair. She was reading her notebook again. She looked up when he held out the printout. "Updated wind data, ma'am. There's a cell building to the northwest. Forecast says it stays clear of our window, but the commander wanted everyone to have the revised numbers." "Thank you." She took the sheet. He started to move on. "Torres." Her voice was quiet. He stopped. "Yes, ma'am. The spill this morning. Don't carry it all day. It didn't affect anything important, and Major Harlan's already moved on." Torres blinked. He hadn't introduced himself to her. She'd used his name anyway. "How did you—" "Your name tape." She gestured at his shoulder. "And I was watching when it happened. You recovered fast. That's what matters in this environment, not the spill." Torres stood for a moment, unsure what to do with that. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." He walked away, feeling slightly altered the way young people sometimes do after an older person sees them clearly at a moment when they expected to be invisible. At 11:40, Major Harlan called a final all-pilots brief to review the emergency protocol changes prompted by the grounded support aircraft. It was a short brief, 7 minutes, covering revised contingency vectors and updated emergency landing priorities. When it was over, pilots began moving toward their aircraft. Emily stood, picked up her flight bag, and started for the door. Mitchell stepped in beside her. He was heading the same direction, but the positioning was deliberate. "Last chance for any questions," he said. "No questions. Wind's a little sporty to the northwest. Might get bumpy in the third quadrant." I saw the update. Older aircraft can get a little unpredictable in turbulence. The control surfaces on that airframe are entirely manual. No fly-by-wire, no computer assist. He said it like a man explaining something helpful, but there was an edge of performance underneath. It can be physically demanding if you're not prepared for it. Emily walked through the door, and he walked with her into the light. She stopped and turned to face him. "Captain Mitchell," she said. Her voice was measured and direct. Not unkind, not warm. Precise. "I understand what you're doing, and I don't think you're doing it to be cruel. You're doing it because you're trained to assess risk, and you've assessed me as a risk. I respect the instinct." She looked at him steadily. "But I need you to trust me when I tell you I'm not." Mitchell looked at her for a moment. Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite doubt, but the first movement toward it. "I just want the day to go well," he said. "So do I." She walked toward the flight line. He watched her go. For the first time all morning, he didn't have an immediate follow-up thought. Martinez was waiting at the Sabre when Emily arrived. "Actuator assembly is clean," he said. "I relubricated the pivot point and checked deflection range at both temperature extremes. You've got full travel consistent response." "Good. Can I ask you something?" His voice was careful. "Go ahead. When you put your hand on the stabilizer this morning." He paused. "You hadn't done a formal inspection yet. You hadn't reviewed the maintenance log. You just—" He searched for the word, felt it. Emily was pulling on her flight gloves. "Yes." "How?" She looked at him. "Because I've spent enough time with aircraft that I know what healthy feels like. And when something isn't quite right, there's a quality to it. Like knowing the difference between someone talking normally and someone talking the way people do right before they're about to tell you something bad." She finished with the gloves. "You know that quality too, Sergeant. You've been doing this long enough." Martinez was quiet for a moment. "I do know it," he said. "I just didn't know other people could feel it from the outside." "Most can't. You have to fly enough hours and break down enough times in aircraft that didn't have that quality to know what the difference means." He stood beside her for a moment. The aircraft was between them and the rest of the flight line, and in that momentary quiet, he looked at her with the full weight of the question that had been building in him since 8:45. "Ghostwriter," he said. She looked at him. Her face was still. "It's your emergency ID on the manifest," he said. "I saw it when I pulled your profile for the maintenance certification." Emily said nothing. "I was crew chief at Barksdale in 2009. I was there for a search and rescue operation in restricted airspace. The whole thing went wrong inside the first hour, and we lost contact with 3 of the 4 aircraft we'd sent in." He was speaking carefully the way people speak when they're reconstructing something they haven't let themselves fully reconstruct in a long time. "One pilot stayed on station alone. Enemy fire. Systems damaged. She protected the rescue corridor for 47 minutes until the extraction team could get the wounded out." He stopped. "They never gave us a name. The mission was classified. The record was sealed. But the call sign they used in the radio traffic—" "Sergeant," Emily said quietly. He stopped. Her expression hadn't changed in any dramatic way, but something in her eyes had shifted, something between acknowledgement and the very private act of setting something down. "It was a long time ago," she said. "Not for the men you kept alive," Martinez said. His voice had changed. "Not for me." There was a silence between them that had weight. Then Emily looked at the aircraft. "Let's make sure she's ready," she said. Martinez nodded. He was the kind of man who understood when a conversation had given everything it was going to give, and he honored that. They began the final pre-flight. Wuhan. 12 minutes before the gates opened, Sergeant Major Cole Bennett found Lieutenant Reyes standing near the observation line watching the ground crews complete their final checks. Bennett stopped beside him. "Lieutenant?" Reyes looked up. Senior NCOs of Bennett's rank weren't often the ones to initiate conversations with junior officers, and Reyes adjusted his posture automatically. "Sergeant Major." Bennett looked out at the flight line. His eyes found the Sabre almost immediately. "You spoke with the vintage performer this morning," Bennett said. Reyes considered being defensive about it, decided it wasn't worth it. "Briefly, she gave me some advice I didn't ask for." "Was it good advice?" Reyes glanced at his left boot. He'd switched out the insole at the last minute. His foot was fine. "Yes, actually." Bennett was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was very controlled. "I want to tell you something about that woman, and I want you to listen carefully, because I am not a man who says things like this without reason." Reyes turned to face him fully. "There are people in this world who have carried things that would have destroyed most of the rest of us," Bennett said. "They don't carry it loudly. They don't wear it where you can see it. But it's there in everything they do, in how they move, in how they see a situation, before anyone else sees it, in the way they treat a 20-year-old airman who spilled coffee like he's worth paying attention to." Reyes went still. "I don't know what you said to her this morning," Bennett continued. "But whatever you assumed about her based on what you saw, the clothes, the age, the aircraft, I'm telling you now, before you go up there and watch what happens, set it aside. All of it." "Who is she?" Reyes asked. His voice was lower than he'd intended. Bennett looked back at the flight line. "Someone the sky owes a debt to," he said. "And today, maybe she's going to collect." He walked away. Reyes stood where he was for a long moment. Across the tarmac, Emily Carter climbed into the cockpit of the Sabre. She didn't look around. She didn't check to see who was watching. She put on her helmet, adjusted the oxygen mask, and began her final pre-start checklist with the calm, unhurried focus of someone who had done this in conditions none of the people watching her could imagine. The canopy came down. The engine turned over, and the ghost of Falcon Ridge. The one who had been there all morning, quiet in a corner, reading a notebook, feeling the bones of an aircraft with her bare hands, leaving people slightly altered. In the wake of brief conversations, she began to wake up. The engine sound changed the moment Emily Carter advanced the throttle. It wasn't loud at first. It built the way certain kinds of authority build quietly from somewhere deep until it was the only thing in the room. The restored Sabre's engine had a voice that the modern jets didn't have, a raw mechanical honesty that made no attempt to be smooth. It was the sound of controlled combustion without 40 years of noise-dampening engineering between you and the fire. Martinez stood at the wingtip and listened. He had heard that engine run twice the day before during test cycles and once this morning during warm-up. He knew its sound. But something was different now with Emily in the cockpit. The engine sounded the same technically. The RPMs were identical on his gauge. But it felt different the way an instrument sounds different when the right musician is playing it versus a competent technician running a sound check. He couldn't explain that to anyone, so he kept it to himself. In the cockpit, Emily ran through her final checks with a steadiness that had nothing to do with the absence of nerves and everything to do with the presence of something that had long ago replaced them. She had been afraid in aircraft before. She had been genuinely physically terrified in ways that the young pilots on this base had not yet had the opportunity to be. What she had learned the hard way, the only way that lesson actually sticks, was that fear and function were not opposites. You could be afraid and precise at the same time. In fact, the fear properly understood sharpened things. She scanned her instruments. Oil pressure, hydraulic pressure, engine temperature. She checked her radio on the tower frequency. Falcon Ridge Tower, Ghost Rider ready for taxi to holding point. There was a pause from the tower that lasted about 2 seconds longer than it should have. Then, Ghost Rider, Falcon Ridge Tower. Say again your call sign. Emily's expression didn't change. Tower, Ghost Rider. Restored F-86 Sabre. Demonstration slot 4. Ready for taxi. Another pause. Shorter this time. Ghost Rider Tower. Taxi to holding point Bravo via Alpha. Winds 270 at 12. Altimeter 299er2. 299er2 Ghost Rider. She released the brake and began to move. In the tower, the duty controller leaned toward his supervisor. Did you catch that call sign? The supervisor was already on a different radio channel. He held up one finger. Wait. He said something into his headset that the controller couldn't hear. Then he set the headset down and stood very still for a moment. Log it accurate, the supervisor said finally. Don't change it. Log exactly what she gave you. The controller typed it in. Ghost Rider. He looked at it on the screen for a second. You know who that is? He asked. The supervisor looked out the tower window toward the moving Sabre. I know who that was, he said quietly. I don't know who she is now. He didn't explain further. Captain Mitchell was completing his own pre-start sequence when his radio crackled with the tower exchange. He heard it with half his attention, a routine taxi call from the vintage performer. He was in the middle of checking his fuel state and didn't register the call sign clearly. But Brooke, sitting in his own cockpit across the apron, heard it. He heard it very clearly. He sat with it for a moment. Then he keyed his intercom. Mitchell? Go ahead. Did you catch the Vintage Slots Tower call? Partial. Something about taxi clearance. Why? Brooks hesitated. He wasn't sure what he was feeling exactly. He was a precise thinker. He'd been told that by instructors since flight school, and imprecise feelings made him cautious about speaking. No reason, he said. Just making sure everyone's on frequency. He closed the intercom and went back to his pre-start checklist. But he did not stop thinking about the call sign. The crowd began entering the gates at 12 on the dot, and Falcon Ridge Air Base underwent the particular transformation that happened whenever civilians flooded a military space. The geometry of the place didn't change, but its character shifted. Voices that had been clipped and professional became louder, more varied, animated with the particular energy of people who were about to see something that's still, after decades of aviation being a commonplace fact of life, managed to make grown adults feel like children standing at the edge of something enormous. The first 3 demonstration slots went exactly as planned. Lieutenant Volk flew the opening sequence, a precise aerobatics display, in the base's primary trainer variant. The crowd was warm without being electric. This was the appetizer, and the audience understood it as such. They applauded at the right moments, with the measured appreciation of people who respected competence, without being particularly moved by it. The second slot was a 2-ship formation from a visiting team. Crisp. Professional. Impressive in the cold technical sense. Then Lieutenant Reyes took the runway for slot 3. He flew well. Better than well, actually. He was gifted, and today the gift was showing. He pulled an elevator reversal at the top of his climb that drew a genuine sound from the crowd, the involuntary collective exhale that only happens when a body of people simultaneously forgets to breathe. His recovery was textbook clean, and when he rolled level and came back down the runway at crowd level, the applause was real. He taxied off and climbed out of the cockpit, flushed and breathing hard, and the first thing he did was look across the flight line toward the Sabre. Emily was still at the holding point. She hadn't moved. She wasn't watching him. Her helmet was on visor down. He had the strange sensation he couldn't account for it and didn't try to. That she had been aware of exactly what his maneuvers were and what they meant in the same way an experienced card player is aware of what the other players at the table are holding. He walked toward the debrief area and said nothing to anyone about that sensation. At 12:47, Sergeant Major Bennett found Major Harlan near the operations tent. Harlan was on a radio and held up a finger. Bennett waited. He waited with the practiced patience of a career NCO, not passive, not restless, simply ready. Harlan finished the call and lowered the radio. "You wanted something, Sergeant Major." "I want to know who approved the Ghostwriter call sign on the manifest," Bennett said. Directly, no preamble. Harlan looked at him for a moment. Something in his expression closed slightly the way a door closes when someone in a house hears an unexpected sound. "It came in with her credentials," Harlan said carefully. Regional Aviation Association submitted it as her registered demonstration call sign. "Major." Bennett's voice was very quiet. "I've been doing this for 31 years. I have never once seen an emergency identification field used for a demonstration call sign on a festival manifest. That field is for operational records only." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "The authorization came from group level," he said finally. "I know that. I'm asking why." Harlan looked toward the flight line. Out there, the Sabre was beginning to move from the holding point toward the runway. Even from this distance, the engine note was distinct. "There are some records," Harlan said, "that are worth honoring, even informally, even if the person who holds them has specifically asked not to be honored." Bennett absorbed that. "She asked," he said, "specifically not to be recognized. Apparently, she's been quite consistent about it for approximately 15 years. Bennett was quiet for a long moment. He watched the Sabre reach the runway threshold. And yet, someone at group level approved the call sign anyway. Someone at group level who flew as her wingman on a classified operation in 2009, Harlan said, and who has spent 15 years looking for a way to give her something she'd actually accept. He paused. This was the best he could manage. Bennett closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked at the runway. "Does she know?" "She signed the manifest herself," Harlan said. "So she saw the field. She hasn't said a word about it." That's her answer. That's her answer. The Sabre rolled to the runway threshold and stopped. Emily Carter's voice came over the tower frequency, clear and unhurried. "Falcon Ridge Tower Ghost Rider ready for departure." The crowd, 20,000 people distributed along the festival line, shifted and stirred. There was always a particular attention change when a new slot was announced. But something about this one was different, and the crowd could feel it without knowing why, the way animals respond to atmospheric pressure changes before the instruments catch it. The tower responded immediately. "Ghost Rider Tower, cleared for takeoff. Runway 27, winds 275 at 14. 27 Ghost Rider, rolling." The throttle went forward. The engine voice changed from a patient idle to something with genuine intent behind it. The aircraft began to move. Mitchell was in the pilot's ready area when it happened. He was reviewing his own timing cues for the finale, running through mental repetitions of the maneuver sequence, the way athletes visualize before competition. He had done this before every significant flight for 10 years. It was part of his process, and he believed in it. He was not watching the runway. Brooks was watching. Brooks had positioned himself near the observation point, under the pretense of reviewing his own timing. But the truth was that since the tower call, he had felt something he couldn't categorize, and had decided the most useful thing he could do was pay attention. He watched the Sabre roll. The aircraft accelerated down the runway with a directness that was physically different from the modern jets. No fly-by-wire system smoothing the inputs. No computer interpreting the pilot's intentions and executing them with digital precision. Whatever happened between Emily Carter's hands on the stick and the aircraft's control surfaces was a direct mechanical conversation, unmediated. The Sabre lifted off. Brooks watched the rotation and felt something happen in his chest. The aircraft went up the way certain people enter a room without announcement, without performance, with a quality of inevitability that makes everyone else in the space rearrange themselves slightly in response. She didn't climb straight. The initial departure turned into a rolling climb that had been invisible in the takeoff roll and emerged at altitude as something that made the crowd go audibly still. Not cheering, not yet. Watching. The particular quality of watching that happens when an audience has just been informed non-verbally and without any possibility of misunderstanding that something real is occurring. Brooks said under his breath, and to no one, "There it is." He didn't know exactly what he meant. He knew exactly what he meant. In the observation stands, Airman Torres was off duty for the demonstration period. Ground crew cycled through rest rotations during the show. And he had found a spot near the back of the public area where he could watch without anyone noticing he was off a beat from the rest of the crowd. He wasn't thinking about the coffee spill anymore. He was watching the Sabre. He had grown up watching air shows. His grandfather had brought him to his first one when he was 6, standing on a hard-packed field in Arizona, with his head tilted back until his neck ached, watching aircraft become small moving points of light at the top of their climbs, before they swept back down into noise and wind. He had chased that feeling into a military career. It was the reason he was standing in this uniform at this base, at this particular moment in his life. He had felt that feeling a few times since. Good pilots gave you a version of it. Emily Carter was giving him the original. He couldn't have articulated the difference technically. He wasn't a pilot. He couldn't parse what he was seeing in terms of control inputs, or energy management, or angle of attack. But he had grown up watching aircraft, and he knew the way. You know the difference between a musician playing notes and a musician playing music, that what was happening above him was not a performance. It was a conversation between a woman and the sky by everything visible was answering. Ottawa. Mitchell heard the crowd change from inside the ready area. It wasn't the volume during the earlier slots had been comparable technically. It was the quality. He was a man who had spent enough time performing for crowds that he understood crowd sound the way a musician understands silence, by what was in it and what wasn't. What was in this crowd sound the held quality of breath not quite exhaled. The collective attention of 20,000 people who had stopped waiting for the next thing and were fully present in the current one. What wasn't in it? The performed enthusiasm of people who knew they were supposed to cheer. The reflexive applause of a crowd responding to a cue. The comfortable appreciation of something impressive, but expected. He walked to the observation window. He looked up. For a moment, he didn't speak. Brooks came to stand beside him without a word, which meant he had left his timing position, which he never did before a flight. The Sabre was in a rolling reversal at altitude that Mitchell's mind immediately began to analyze. Entry speed stick pressure required physical G-loading on an airframe of that generation, the specific skill of making that maneuver look like inevitability rather than effort. He ran through the math without meaning to, the pilot's reflex of translating what he saw into what he knew. The math came back. He looked at it. He ran it again. "That's not a demonstration pilot," he said. The words came out before he decided to say them. Quiet. Matter of fact. The tone of a man making a correction to a previous statement he'd made without enough information. Brooks didn't respond. He'd reached the same conclusion approximately 90 seconds earlier. Mitchell watched the aircraft come through the reversal and set up for a second maneuver. His pilot's eye was tracking everything: the energy state, the positioning relative to the crowd line, the aircraft's attitude through the transition. Every input was not just correct, it was optimal. Not optimal in the textbook sense. Optimal in the sense that comes from knowing where the margins are, because you have been to the margins repeatedly under conditions where being wrong about the margin was not an academic problem. You could not fake that. He had never seen it faked. "Brooks," he said. "Yeah. Who is she?" Brooks had been asking himself the same question for the last hour. He had been approaching it from the call sign from the tower exchange, from the way Martinez had looked at her during the pre-flight, from the way Bennett had walked past the operations desk and stopped and then walked out of the building with something different behind his eyes. "I don't know," he said. "But I think someone here does." Mitchell didn't look away from the window. "Find out." Brooks left. Oh, the Sabre came down the crowd line at low altitude. At this point in the demonstration, Emily was flying what the program listed as a high-speed pass, a standard element, the kind of maneuver every vintage aircraft performed at every festival, the crowd-pleasing rush of a fast jet going by at eye level. It was supposed to be the uncomplicated part, the part where you just flew the speed and let the noise do the work. Emily flew it differently. It wasn't higher speed, the airframe had limits, and she respected them precisely. It wasn't a different altitude. What was different was the quality of the control through the element. The aircraft came down the line without the slight energy variation that every aircraft exhibits in that maneuver, the micro corrections and adjustments that the instruments record, but that skilled eyes can see as a kind of aliveness in the flight path, the way a skilled rider's horse moves with the slightly variable rhythm of a real animal, rather than the mechanical consistency of a machine. The Sabre came down the crowd line the way water runs down a smooth surface. No corrections, no adjustments, no conversation between the pilot and the aircraft about what needed to happen. Just the aircraft doing what it was supposed to do perfectly, because the person inside it had long ago stopped giving it instructions and started simply telling it the truth about the sky. The crowd made a sound. 20,000 people making one sound. Not applause, something before applause. The involuntary sound of a crowd that has just experienced something that arrived before their critical faculties could intercept it. In the observation stands, Torres stood with his mouth slightly open. On the flight line, Martinez stood with his hands at his sides, and his expression doing something he would have been embarrassed to admit to. In the tower, the duty controller had stopped logging and was simply watching, and in the pilot's ready area, Mitchell had gone very still. Bennett found Harlan again at 13:20. He didn't ask another question. He made a statement. "I need you to pull her service record." Harlan looked at him. "I can't pull classified service records, Sergeant Major. Not at this level." "I'm not asking for the classified portion," Bennett said. "I'm asking for whatever is publicly accessible." Whatever she filed with the Regional Aviation Association. Whatever group level gave you when they approved the slot. Harlan studied him for a long moment. Why? Because Mitchell is going to ask me in about 10 minutes, Bennett said, and I would rather have the answer than not. Harlan went into the operations tent. He was inside for 4 minutes. When he came back, he had a single sheet of paper. He handed it to Bennett without saying anything. Bennett looked at it. He stood there for a long time. The sheet contained Emily Carter's basic aviation credentials. FAA type ratings, flight hours in unclassified categories, demonstration qualifications, standard information, the kind of thing any licensed pilot submitted when applying for a festival slot. What made Bennett go still was the flight hours column. In the unclassified total, the hours she was cleared to disclose, Emily Carter had logged more flight time than most commercial airline captains. In the type ratings column, she was current on 6 airframes. 6, not 6 total. 6 current, maintained. Within the last 12 calendar months, one of them was the restored F-86 Sabre. One of them was the F-22 Raptor, the same aircraft Captain Mitchell flew. Bennett looked at that for a very long moment. She's current on the Raptor, he said. The authorization from group level included a note, Harlan said. The note said, and I'm quoting directly, current on all platforms through last quarter operational clearances, maintained no restrictions. Bennett looked up from the paper. She didn't just used to fly, she's still flying. Yes. Classified. That would be the implication. Bennett was quiet. Then, she came here in a pickup truck and a faded jacket. Yes. And nobody knew. Harlan paused. That's rather the point, I think. That's rather always been the point with her. Bennett folded the paper with careful precision and placed it in his breast pocket. He looked out at the sky where the Sabre was completing its final element of the demonstration. Does Mitchell know? He asked. Mitchell is about to figure it out, Harlan said quietly. As if on cue, Bennett's radio crackled. It was Brooks. Sergeant Major, I need 5 minutes. Flight line North End, Bennett said. 2 minutes. He clicked off and looked at Harlan one more time. When she lands, Bennett said, I want to be the first person at the aircraft. Understood. Mitchell had left the observation window. He had gone looking for answers the way he did everything directly without signaling the search covering ground quickly. He had spoken to 2 ground crew members and gotten polite non-answers. He had checked the visible portion of the manifest on the operations desk and found the basic credential summary. He was standing in the middle of the operations area when the thought hit him. Not a suspicion, a certainty. The kind that arrives not through reasoning, but through accumulation, every small observation from the morning suddenly rearranging itself around a center point that had been there all along. The way she sat in the corner and listened without needing to participate. The way she put her hand on the stabilizer and knew. The way she looked at him when he offered advice, patient, not dismissive. The look of someone who had received that particular offering many times and had long since stopped being moved by it. The way Martinez looked at her during pre-flight. The way Harlan crossed the room personally to ask if she needed anything. The way the tower had paused on the call sign. The way Bennett had stopped at the operations desk. He went to the window again. She was on her final pass. He watched her fly, and he understood with the comprehensive and slightly disorienting clarity of a man who has just been proven wrong about something he was very certain about, that every assumption he had made about Emily Carter from the moment she walked through the briefing room door had been constructed from the same material. His own reflection. He had looked at her and seen what he expected to see because he had not looked carefully enough to see what was actually there. He had offered advice she didn't need. He had performed competence at someone who had forgotten more about this specific skill than he had yet had the time to learn. He had called her sweetheart in a room full of people and laughed when the room laughed with him. He stood at the window with that understanding. It was not comfortable. He did not try to make it comfortable. The Sabre came down final approach. The crowd, which had been restless with end-of-demonstration energy during the turn from the last element, went quiet again, as the aircraft lined up on the runway. There was something in the approach that held them the same quality that had characterized everything else. Nothing extraneous. Nothing performed. The aircraft coming back to Earth the way it had gone up with a directness that left no room for ornamentation. Martinez was standing at the runway's edge. He watched the main gear touch. It was a full-stop landing. No roll, no dragging it out. The aircraft came down cleanly, firmly, and then was simply on the ground. The crowd applause this time was different from everything that had come before it. It built slowly the way real appreciation builds from a place slightly deeper than the reflexive response. Torres in the stands was clapping with his hands above his head. He was not aware he had done this until the man next to him glanced over. He lowered his hands. He didn't stop clapping. The Sabre taxied clear of the runway. The radio crackled in the tower. "Ghost Rider," Emily said. Her voice was the same as it had been on the taxi call, measured, unhurried, entirely unchanged by what had just happened. "Clear of the runway. Fuel state nominal. Requesting taxi to parking." The controller responded immediately. "Ghost Rider Tower. Taxi to parking via Alpha. Outstanding work today." A pause. Then from Emily. "Tell your crew chief Martinez. He did outstanding work. I just drove." The controller looked at his supervisor. The supervisor was smiling for the first time all day. "Copy that, Ghost Rider," the controller said. "Tower out." The Sabre moved toward the parking area, and Sergeant Major Cole Bennett, who had been waiting at the north end of the flight line since leaving Harlan 3 minutes ago, began walking toward it. He had something to say that had been waiting 15 years to be said. He intended to say it before anyone else reached the aircraft. His pace was steady and deliberate. The pace of a man who had waited long enough and was no longer willing to wait any longer. Behind him across the apron, Mitchell stood at the entrance to the operations building and watched Bennett walk. He watched for a moment, then he followed. Bennett reached the aircraft before the engine finished spooling down. He stood at the wingtip and waited. He had his hands at his sides and his chin level, and his expression arranged into something that looked from a distance like professional attention. Up close, anyone who knew how to read a career soldier's face would have seen it for what it was, a man holding himself very carefully together while he waited for something he had needed for a long time. The canopy opened. Emily pulled off her helmet and set it on the rail. Her hair was damp at the temples. She ran one hand through it and looked out at the apron with the particular scanning quality she had, taking in the full perimeter before focusing on anything specific. She saw Bennett immediately. She went still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of recognition of a person who has been carrying a piece of unfinished business for so long that seeing it standing in front of them produces less shock than a kind of bone-deep relief. She climbed down from the aircraft without hurrying. She pulled off her flight gloves one finger at a time and stood in front of him. Bennett looked at her face for a moment. He was not a man who looked at people the way he was looking at her now, with the full weight of 15 years sitting behind his eyes visible, making no attempt at concealment. "Master Sergeant Bennett," Emily said. Her voice was quiet. "Sergeant Major now," he said. "Congratulations." She meant it. He held himself straight. "Ma'am, I need to say something to you, and I need to say it before anyone else gets over here, and I need you to let me finish before you redirect me." Emily looked at him steadily. "Go ahead." 2009. The Karimov Corridor. 3 aircraft down, rescue team pinned enemy activity on both approach vectors. He was speaking from memory, and the memory was exact, the kind of exact that belongs to events that rewire the people who survive them. "We lost communications with Extraction Command at hour 1. The 2 support birds turned back. Protocol required the 3rd aircraft to withdraw." He stopped for one beat. "You didn't withdraw." "Bennett, you said let me finish." She closed her mouth. "You stayed on station for 47 minutes, he said. "Alone. Damaged aircraft. 1 engine running rough, which I know because we could hear it in the radio traffic when you checked in with us on the ground frequency. You made 8 suppression passes on the eastern approach while our medic worked on the wounded. 8 passes. In a damaged aircraft. Without support. without anyone knowing you were still there except the 14 men on the ground whose lives depended on it. His jaw tightened once. I was one of those men. The apron was quiet around them. The crowd noise from the festival line was a distant texture. The sound of the Saber's engine fading to silence made the space between them feel larger and smaller at the same time. "I know," Emily said. Simply. "I never knew your name." The mission was classified top to bottom. We were told the pilot was unaccountable. That was the official language. Unaccountable, as if you'd simply failed to report. His voice stayed controlled, but something under it was not controlled at all. I spent 3 years trying to find out who flew that corridor. Every avenue was sealed. Every record was locked. I eventually stopped because stopping was the only thing that kept me functional. Emily was watching him with an expression that was almost impossible to read. Not because it was hidden, but because it was too full. Too many things at once. "And then I walked past a manifest this morning," Bennett said, "and there was a name and a call sign, and I felt the floor come out from under me a little bit, because I'd heard that call sign on a ground frequency 15 years ago in the dark, with tracer fire going overhead, and it was the sound of someone choosing to stay when every rational calculation said go." He stopped. Emily looked down for a moment. When she looked up, something had changed in her face. The professional composure she wore like a second skin had not broken. It had simply moved aside just enough. "The aircraft was already damaged when I checked the withdrawal option," she said. Retreating meant a probable single-engine failure over hostile terrain. Staying gave me a better angle on the threat axis. It was tactically rational. "That's not why you stayed." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It's not." "Then why?" She looked at him. "Because you were still on the ground." Bennett stood with that for a long moment. His jaw moved. He pressed his lips together, and then opened them, and then closed them again, and finally he said in a voice that was very quiet and very steady, 14 men went home because of what you did. 3 of them have children now who wouldn't exist otherwise. My daughter was born in 2011. Her name is Claire. She's 14 years old." He stopped. "I would like her to know the name of the person she can thank for the fact that her father came home." Emily's face did the thing it had been doing all morning, adding information to an internal file, processing it, deciding what it meant. But this time what followed was not the cool assessment of a pilot reading data. This time it was something human and undefended. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "You were all still fighting when I got there. You were doing everything right. I just bought you time." "You bought us everything," Bennett said. The words landed without drama, without decoration. They were simply true, and Emily Carter, who had spent 15 years declining to be the recipient of truth like that, stood in it for a moment and did not step back. Then she straightened slightly, and the composure settled back into place, not as a wall, but as a structure she needed to function. "How many people on base know?" she asked. "Harlan knows. The tower supervisor suspects. Martinez ran your ID through the maintenance certification system, and I believe he made the connection." He paused. "And Mitchell is currently walking across this apron." Emily turned. Mitchell was 40 meters away and closing. He was walking the way he always walked, directly, purposefully. But something was different about the quality of it. The performed confidence was absent. He looked at this distance like a man walking toward something he wasn't sure he was ready for, but had decided to walk toward anyway. Behind him, Brooks and Reyes were following at a distance that was close enough to be clearly intentional, and far enough to communicate that they understood this moment didn't belong to them. Emily turned back to Bennett. "Give me a minute with him," she said. Bennett looked at Mitchell approaching, then back at her. He nodded. He stepped to the side, and in doing so, stepped out of the primary line of the moment. The way a person steps out of a photograph they understand they're not supposed to be in. Mitchell stopped 3 feet from Emily. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the aircraft. He looked at her. "I owe you an apology," he said. Emily waited. "This morning, in this briefing room." He held her gaze. "I was condescending. I was dismissive. I made assumptions about your experience and your ability based on—" He paused, choosing the word deliberately, appearance, "and I was wrong." "You were," she said. He blinked. He had expected some version of gracious deflection. He had prepared for the conversation where she said it was fine, no harm done, don't worry about it. He had not prepared for simple agreement. "I was wrong," he said again, quieter. "Yes." He looked at her for another moment. "Who are you actually?" "I'm a pilot," she said. "I've been flying since I was 19 years old. I've flown things in conditions that I don't discuss for reasons that I can't explain for people who don't get thanked publicly. And then when it was time, I stepped back from the public part and kept flying the private part." She paused. "That's all I am." "That's not all you are," Bennett said from the side. Emily glanced at him. He looked back at her without apology. Mitchell stood between them, aware that he was standing in the middle of something he only partially understood, and that the partial understanding was already more than he'd had 3 hours ago, when he'd laughed loud enough for the whole briefing room to hear. "The call sign," he said. "Ghost Rider, I made a joke about it this morning." "I heard you. I said it was a Halloween costume." "I remember." He absorbed the discomfort of that directly without flinching from it. "I'd like to know what it means, if you're willing to tell me." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "It was given to me by a crew on the ground," she said, "during an operation where I was the only aircraft they could still hear. They gave it to me because—" She stopped. She appeared to be deciding something. "Because a ghost is something that shows up when it has no reason to still be there. When by all rights, it should be gone." She paused. "I stayed longer than I should have been able to. They needed a name for that. Ghost Rider was the name they chose." Mitchell was quiet. Behind him, Reyes had moved close enough to hear. His expression had gone through several things in rapid succession and had landed on something that looked like the specific emotion of a young person realizing they have been operating with a fundamentally incomplete map of the world. "Why did you leave the service?" Reyes asked. Emily looked past Mitchell at him. Reyes held the look without backing down from it, another thing he'd learned in approximately the last 4 hours. "I didn't leave the service," Emily said. The silence after that statement was total. Mitchell turned to look at Reyes. Reyes looked back at him. Brooks, from his position slightly further back, closed his eyes briefly in the expression of a man whose suspicion has just been confirmed. "You're still active," Mitchell said. Slowly. "That's not a characterization I can confirm or deny to personnel below a specific clearance level," Emily said. "But I will tell you that the 6 type ratings on my current FAA record are not historical, and that the authorization for my slot here today did not come through a regional aviation association." Mitchell stared at her. "Who authorized you?" "Someone who owed me a favor." She almost smiled. "And who thought it would be good for me to come back to a flight line for a day and be reminded that I still know how to do this." "You didn't need reminding," Bennett said. "No." She looked at the saber. "But it was good anyway." The next demonstration slot went up at 1350. It was a 2-aircraft element, a coordination display between a training variant and the base's primary fast jet, designed as a bridge between the vintage demonstration and Mitchell's finale. The crowd received it well. The flying was technically clean and the formation work was precise, but something had changed along the flight line. The pilots and ground crew who had been in Emily Carter's orbit since morning were carrying something different. It wasn't a transformation, nothing so dramatic. It was the subtle recalibration that happens in people when they have been shown that their read on a situation was incomplete. The particular internal adjustment of recategorizing. Reyes stood at the observation line and watched the 2-aircraft element with a pilot's analytical eye. He was not thinking about the aircraft in the air. He was thinking about the morning's briefing, replaying it with the sound turned up on different frequencies. He was hearing Mitchell's laugh differently. He was hearing his own question. "Is your crew chief not handling that?" and feeling the particular discomfort of a person reviewing a recording of themselves, behaving in ways they would now choose differently. It was not a comfortable feeling. He decided that was probably the appropriate response. Torres appeared beside him, off-duty hands in his pockets. "Wild day," Torres said. Reyes glanced at him. "Yeah. Did you see her pre-flight?" "Some of it. She told me not to carry the coffee thing all day." Torres was quiet for a moment. "She knew my name. She'd been in the corner of that room for maybe 30 minutes, and she knew my name." He paused. "How do you even do that?" "You pay attention," Reyes said. "You pay actual attention to what's around you, instead of what you think is around you." Torres thought about that. "Is that what she has?" "She just pays attention better." Reyes looked at the sky where the two aircraft were completing their formation break. "She has that," he said. "She also has about 20 years of things that happened in places nobody knows about that taught her exactly what matters and exactly what doesn't." He paused. "We just had the presentation. She's been living the material." Torres was quiet for a moment. "That's kind of a lot to take in." "Yeah," Reyes said. "It is." The emergency started at 1417. It started as a sound and engine note from the two aircraft element that was not right, arriving in the ears of everyone with enough experience before their eyes could confirm it. Martinez heard it first. He was at the maintenance area, and he stopped moving and looked up with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent decades listening to aircraft. The trailing aircraft in the formation had developed a compressor stall. On a training day in the controlled environment, a compressor stall in a capable modern aircraft was serious, but manageable. The pilot would have time to respond. Systems would provide guidance. The recovery procedure was practiced and reliable. This was not a controlled environment. This was a festival. The crowd line was 300 meters to the east. The aircraft's recovery altitude was marginal, and the pilot, Lieutenant Carl Devers, was 24 years old and had never experienced a real compressor stall outside the simulator. The sound of it came through the radio simultaneously with Devers' voice. "Falcon Ridge Bravo 2, I've got compressor stall, left engine losing thrust." The tower responded immediately. "Emergency protocol. The ground emergency teams were already moving, but the aircraft's flight path was wrong." In the seconds following the initial stall onset, the natural human response, the one that Devers was now executing because it was deeply ingrained, and because he had never been here before in a real aircraft, was to pull back on the stick and apply power, which, in a compressor stall, was precisely the wrong response. Pulling back tightened the approach angle. Adding power on an unstable compressor deepened the stall. The aircraft was in a slow, curving descent that was going to take it across the crowd safety margin in approximately 40 seconds. 40 seconds is a long time when you know what you're doing. It is nothing at all when you don't. Mitchell heard the radio call from the pilot staging area. He was out the door in 3 seconds, moving at a run toward the flight line, pulling on his headset as he went. His aircraft was next on the schedule, and its engine was already warm. But warm was not running, and getting an F-22 airborne was not a matter of 30 seconds. He got on the radio. "Devers Mitchell, listen to me. Throttle back. Don't add power. Establish glide. Don't pull back on the stick." Devers' voice was controlled but thin. "I'm losing altitude." "I know. Don't fight it. Establish a glide. You have enough altitude for a field landing if you stop fighting the stall." The problem was the heading. The aircraft was not pointed at the field. The aircraft was pointed in its slow, curving descent at the space between the eastern crowd barrier and the secondary parking area. A space that was not the crowd itself, but was not safe either, occupied by vehicles and support equipment and the specific chaos of a festival's back area. Bennett heard the exchange and moved to the flight line. He had no aircraft, no radio authority in the current emergency structure, nothing to offer except 31 years of judgment. He got on his own frequency. "Falcon Ridge Control Bennett, I need whoever has eyes on Bravo 2 to give me heading and altitude." The answer came back in 4 seconds. The heading confirmed what he'd feared. He looked across the apron. Emily Carter was already moving. She was not running. She was moving at the controlled pace of someone who had done this before, which was faster than running because it didn't waste energy on urgency and spent everything on direction. She had her headset in her hand, and she was pulling it on as she moved. She went to the operations desk and picked up the secondary frequency handset, the ground-to-air channel that bypassed the tower hierarchy, and went directly to the aircraft radio. She keyed it. "Bravo! 2, listen to me. Not to the tower, to me." Her voice was level and immediate, the voice of someone removing all options except the correct one. "You are in a left-turning compressor stall descent. You are going to stop adding power right now. You are going to lower your nose 3 degrees, not more. 3 degrees, and you are going to roll left 20 degrees to correct your heading toward the secondary field approach." A pause. Devers's voice. "I can't. I'm losing." "You are not losing. You have altitude and you have time and you have a functional right engine. But I need you to do exactly what I'm telling you in the next 10 seconds, or you will lose both. Left roll 20 degrees, nose down 3, right now." On the flight line, everyone with eyes on the aircraft watched. The aircraft continued its descent. For 3 seconds, nothing changed. Then slowly, with the visible effort of a young pilot overriding every instinct that was screaming at him, the aircraft banked left. 20 degrees. The nose moved. 3 degrees down roughly. Slightly less. Close enough. The compressor stall sound changed. Not resolved, still present, still rough, but the deepening stopped. The aircraft was now in a controlled emergency descent, rather than an uncontrolled one. "Good," Emily said. Her voice hadn't changed at all. "Hold that. Hold exactly that. You're pointed at the secondary field now. When you pass through 800 feet, call it. Don't look at anything except your heading and your altitude. I'm with you." Mitchell, who had been running his own parallel instructions and had now stopped speaking because Emily's frequency cut through the noise with the clarity of someone who knew exactly what was needed, stood on the flight line with his headset on and listened. He didn't say anything. He let her work. 800 feet. Devers' voice. "Steadier now." Something about the steadiness in Emily's voice had entered his own, the mechanism by which calm offered without performance sometimes transfers between people when nothing else can. "Good. Right engine only. Gear down on my mark. Not yet." She paused, reading something the altitude reports, the heading data on the ground display information that was arriving from multiple sources, and that she was integrating with the same fluid processing she used to read an aircraft's stabilizer with her hands. "Mark, gear down." A pause. "Gear down." Confirmed. "You're going to be long on the approach." "That's fine. There's room. Don't rush the flare. Let the aircraft settle." The next 40 seconds were very quiet on the flight line. Torres at the observation area had gripped the railing without knowing it. His knuckles were white. Around him, the public crowd had gone still in the way crowds go still when they understand that something is real. Reyes was standing at Mitchell's shoulder on the flight line. He realized he was holding his breath and let it out carefully, the way you let out a breath when you're trying not to disturb something. The aircraft came down. It came down long, as Emily had predicted. The touchdown was 200 meters past the threshold marker. It was not elegant. The rollout used the full length of the secondary strip, and then the brakes hard at the end. But the aircraft stopped on the pavement. It stopped on the pavement, and the right engine spooled down, and the aircraft sat still. Devers' voice on the radio. "Bravo 2, down. I'm down, on the field." The control tower frequency erupted with protocol confirmation calls, emergency vehicle dispatch, the structured language of crisis management, transitioning to incident management. It was the sound of people who had prepared for the worst, and were now conducting the business of the fact that the worst had not happened. On the flight line, the breath that had been held collectively for approximately 2 minutes was released approximately collectively. Bennett looked at Emily. She had already set down the handset. She was standing at the operations desk with her hands quiet at her sides, and she was looking at the secondary field where the aircraft sat, and her expression was the expression of someone who has done the thing that needed doing, and is now simply glad it is done. Nothing more than that. No performance. No visible accounting of what just happened. Mitchell walked over to her. He stopped beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "You knew the secondary frequency would go direct to his aircraft," Mitchell said. "Yes." "You knew to give him the left roll and nose-down inputs." It was the only correct set of inputs for that stall configuration at that altitude. You gave them in the right order and the right quantity without instruments and without visual on the aircraft from your position. Emily was quiet for a moment. "I've talked a pilot through that situation before," she said. "The inputs are the inputs." Mitchell looked at her. "How many times have you talked a pilot through a situation like that?" She didn't answer immediately. He waited. "Enough times," she said, "that I stopped counting." Bennett was on his radio for the next 10 minutes, coordinating with the base emergency team to ensure Devers had medical evaluation on the ground standard post-incident protocol. The young pilot was physically unharmed, which was the outcome that mattered. He would have a debrief that would be longer and harder than anything he'd experienced in his career so far, and he would come out of it a different pilot than he'd gone in. That was also the outcome that mattered. Reyes found Martinez at the maintenance area during the pause in operations. Martinez was running a post-incident check on the Sabre standard procedure, ensuring nothing from the emergency communications activity had created any unreported issues with his aircraft. He worked with the focus of a man who used physical tasks to process things that were too large for sitting still. "Martinez," Reyes said. Martinez looked up. "You knew who she was this morning. Before the manifest, before Bennett, before any of it." Reyes wasn't accusing. He was genuinely trying to understand the sequence. "You knew when she put her hand on the stabilizer." Martinez was quiet for a moment. He set down his tool. "I had a feeling," he said. "The way she touched the aircraft, the way she asked about the stabilizer, not what the data said, but how it felt. That's not something you get from textbooks or simulators. That's something you get from being in enough situations where the data and the feeling didn't match, and you had to trust one of them, and you chose the wrong one enough times to learn which one to trust. And then you saw the call sign. And then I saw the call sign." He picked his tool back up. "And I knew for certain what I'd already known for probable." Reyes looked across the apron. Emily was talking to Harlan now, a quiet exchange, short sentences, her hands still his expression attentive. "She said she just bought them time," Reyes said. "The men in the corridor. That's what she said to Bennett. She said she just bought them time." Martinez snorted quietly. It wasn't dismissive. It was the sound of someone who knew the difference between what a thing costs and what a person who did the thing is willing to claim credit for. 14 men, he said. 47 minutes of solo suppression in a damaged aircraft over hostile terrain. He looked at his hands for a moment. "Time," he said. "She calls it time." Reyes stood with that. He turned it over. He looked at it from several angles. "How do you become that?" he asked, not rhetorically. He genuinely wanted to know. Martinez looked at him. "You spend enough years doing the thing that needs doing whether or not anyone is watching," he said. "You make the hard call enough times that the hard call stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like just the next thing. The thing in front of you." He paused. "And you stop keeping score of it. Because once you start keeping score, you start doing it for the score. And that's when it stops being what it is." Reyes absorbed this. He thought about his own flying, the way he mentally cataloged his best maneuvers, the way he calculated his ranking against the other young pilots in the squadron, the way his internal narrative of himself was built around the documented version of his skill rather than the practiced version. He didn't say anything about that, but he kept it. "She's going to go back to wherever she came from after today," Reyes said. "Isn't she?" "Yes. And we won't know where that is." "No. And she won't—" He stopped. "She's not going to want anything from this, from today." Martinez looked at him steadily. "She already has what she wanted from today." "What's that?" "She flew," Martinez said simply. "She flew the way it was meant to be flown, in an honest aircraft with no computer between her and the sky, and she brought a young pilot down safely when he needed it." He picked up his tool again. "For someone like her, Lieutenant, that's not nothing. That's the whole thing." Reyes stood for another moment. Then he walked back toward the flight line. He had a finale slot to prepare for, and for the first time in his short but gifted career, he was thinking about it differently. At 14:45, Mitchell's aircraft was at the holding point. He had gone through his entire pre-start and taxi sequence with the kind of focus that had been absent from it this morning. Not because his technique had changed, but because the internal noise around it had gone quiet. The calculations that usually ran in the background, the ones that were always partly about how this looked and what it meant for his standing, and how the audience would receive it, those calculations were offline. What remained was the flying. He sat in the cockpit of the most capable military aircraft in the world and looked out at the runway and thought about a woman flying a 60-year-old machine as it was designed to be flown. He thought about 47 minutes in a damaged aircraft over hostile terrain. He thought about a voice on a secondary frequency level and immediate giving. A frightened young pilot, exactly the 3 inputs he needed in exactly the right order. He thought about what it meant to be good at this. Not decorated, not ranked, not recognized. Good. Actually good. Ghost Rider gave you something today, Brooks said over the intercom from his own aircraft. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. Yeah. Are you going to fly differently because of it? He thought about that. It was the right question. I'm going to try, he said. The tower gave him his clearance. He pushed the throttle forward. And Mitchell, who had spent the entire morning believing he was the main event, flew his finale with the understanding that the main event had already happened quietly in the corner of a briefing room at 7:42 in the morning, when a woman with a worn leather flight bag sat down and waited for everyone else to show her what they were. Mitchell's finale was technically flawless. The crowd knew it and responded accordingly. 20,000 people giving the specific kind of sustained applause that belongs to exceptional skill, performed with exceptional equipment. The F-22 did what the F-22 does, which is things that should not be physically possible in an aircraft of its size and weight. And Mitchell flew it at the limit of what the aircraft could give him, which was the limit of what the day required. He landed clean. He taxied off. He climbed out of the cockpit and accepted the handshakes from his ground crew with the particular grace of a man who had flown well and knew it and no longer needed the knowing to be about anything except the flying. Brooks met him at the wingtip. Good flight, Brooks said. It was. Mitchell pulled off his helmet. Not the best flight of the day. Brooks looked at him for a moment. No, he agreed. It wasn't. They walked toward the debrief area without another word about it. Between them, the absence of Mitchell's usual post-flight commentary, the ranking, the assessment of how it compared, the cataloging of what the audience had seen, sat like something recently removed from a shelf. The space was visible. Neither of them was entirely sure what would eventually fill it. What Mitchell knew, walking across that apron, was that he had flown his finale thinking about honesty. Not performance, not audience, not ranking. He had flown thinking about what it meant to be in an aircraft and inside the truth of it, and the flying had been better for it in ways that didn't show up on any assessment metric he'd been trained to track. He didn't know yet whether that would last. He suspected it would require active maintenance. He suspected that was what the next 20 years were for. The post-demonstration debrief for the emergency incident was held in the main operations room at 15:30. It was mandatory for all demonstration pilots, all senior ground crew, and the primary operations staff. The room held 22 people. Harlan ran it with the deliberate calm of a man who had done serious debriefs before and understood that the goal was not accountability in the punitive sense, but understanding in the operational sense. Extracting every piece of information that might prevent the next incident, before the next incident had the opportunity to occur. Devers sat at the table, looking like a man who had been turned inside out and put back together in a different configuration. He was physically fine, the medical team had confirmed that within minutes of his landing, but there was something about his face that had aged approximately 3 years in the last 90 minutes. His eyes had the specific quality of a person who has been genuinely frightened and has not yet finished processing what that means about the world and about themselves. He had made his statement factual, precise, The pilot's trained instinct for clinical language, even in the aftermath of crisis, and now he sat quietly while the debrief moved through its procedural sections. When Harlan reached the communications response section, he said, "The secondary frequency contact has been noted in the incident record. I want to formally acknowledge that intervention as a contributing factor in the successful outcome." He looked at Emily directly. "Ma'am, your assessment of the stall configuration and your inputs to Lieutenant Devers were correct and timely. They made a material difference." Emily nodded once. "Thank you, Major." Devers looked at her from across the table. He had been looking at her intermittently since the debrief began, with the quality of attention that people direct toward someone who has done something significant for them, that they don't yet have the language to address. He waited for a pause in the procedural flow. "Ms. Carter," he said. The room went slightly quieter. Emily looked at him. He was 24 years old, and he had the face of someone who was choosing his words with the deliberate care of a person who has recently been reminded that words matter. "I want to say something." He stopped. Tried again. "When you came on that frequency, I wasn't right. I was doing exactly the wrong thing, and I knew it somewhere, but I couldn't stop doing it. And then your voice came through, and it was..." He stopped again. "You were so calm. Not like you were pretending to be calm. Like you actually were calm. And something about that, I don't know how to say this." "It crossed over," Emily said quietly. Devers blinked. "Yes, exactly that. It does that sometimes," she said. "When it's real. The calm crosses over." Devers held her gaze for a moment. "How do you get that real calm in a situation like that?" Emily was quiet for a moment. The room waited. "You don't start with the calm," she said. "You start with the problem. You look at exactly what is in front of you, not what might happen, not what should have happened, not what you wish the situation was, what it actually is. And then you take the next correct step. Just one. Not 5 steps ahead, 1 step." She paused. "The calm comes from the focus. It's a byproduct of being completely inside the problem. It's not something you perform." Devers absorbed that carefully, the way a person absorbs something they intend to keep. "I'll remember that," he said. "Good," Emily said. "Because the next time you're in a situation like that, it'll be different details and the same principle, and you'll need it ready." Harlan let the moment complete itself, then continued the debrief. But something had happened in the room. The formal structure of the debrief continued the protocols, the timeline, the corrective recommendations. But underneath it, something had shifted in the collective understanding of the 22 people at that table. The incident had been survivable. The intervention had worked. Those were the operational facts. But the meaning under the facts, what it meant that a woman in civilian clothes with a worn leather flight bag had been the one to bring a 24-year-old pilot through the door between disaster and a field landing. That meaning was sitting in the room with everyone unaddressed and entirely present. When the formal debrief concluded, the room took 10 minutes to decompress into smaller conversations before people began to disperse. Mitchell crossed to the far side of the table where Emily was gathering her notebook. He had something to ask her. He had been carrying it since the flight line, since the moment she set down the handset, after Devers called down safe, and he wasn't sure how to ask it except directly, which was the only way he knew how to do things that mattered. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to be honest about why I'm asking." Emily looked at him, patient, present. "I watched you this morning," Mitchell said, "from the briefing room through the pre-flight, through your demonstration. And then the emergency. And I've been thinking about what I observed as a pilot, setting aside everything else." He paused. "You make decisions faster than anyone I've ever seen. Not just faster, more complete. The secondary frequency call, the stall, inputs the heading correction. You gave Devers 3 correct things in the right order inside 10 seconds, without instruments, without visual on the aircraft. Yes. How much of that is accumulated hours, and how much of it is something else?" Emily studied him. She seemed to be deciding whether the question deserved the full answer or the manageable answer, and which of those was actually more useful to him. The hours give you the library, she said. Every situation you've survived, every aircraft you've lost and recovered, every time the instruments disagreed with your hands and you had to decide which one was telling the truth. All of that goes into a library. And the library gets very large. And then when a situation arrives, you're not calculating from first principles. You're pattern matching. She paused. But the library only works if you were actually present for every book in it. If you were flying to be seen, flying to be assessed, to be ranked, the experience went in, but the learning didn't follow, because your attention was on the wrong thing. Mitchell was very still. "How many hours in your library?" he asked. "More than I can account for in public records," she said. He nodded slowly. "And the something else?" Emily was quiet for a moment. "You genuinely care whether they live," she said. "That's the something else. It's not technique. It's not experience. When Devers was coming down wrong, I wasn't managing an incident. I was talking to a 24-year-old who needed to get home." She looked at Mitchell steadily. "That's not something you can practice. Either it's there or it's not. And if it's there, everything else works faster." Mitchell stood with that for a long moment. "I think I have it," he said. "I think I've always had it. I just built a lot of other things around it that made it harder to access." "I know," Emily said. He blinked at the directness of that. "I know because I watched you fly your finale," she said. "You flew it differently than I expected. Not technically. Technically it was what I expected, and then some. But something in it was different. Something had been cleared out." She paused. "You flew it honest." Mitchell looked at her for a long moment. "That's the first time anyone has said that to me," he said. "That might be the first time you've given them something real to say it about," she replied. "It landed the way certain true things land, without cruelty, without comfort, with just the weight of accuracy." He nodded. He didn't argue with it. Bennett found Emily at the edge of the operations area at 1620. The base was in the structured wind-down of post-event activity equipment, moving crowds, thinning the particular organized fatigue of a large operation completing itself. Emily had her flight bag over one shoulder. She was standing in a posture that said she was approximately 10 minutes from leaving. Bennett had one more thing to say, and he knew it, and he could see from her posture that she knew it too. "There's something I didn't tell you earlier," he said. She waited. 2 months after we got home from the Karimov corridor, the 14 of us who came back, we had a private thing, not official, just the men who were there. We were at Fort Campbell in someone's quarters, nothing formal. He paused. "We didn't know your name, we didn't know your face. All we had was the call sign and the radio voice and 47 minutes of what you did." He looked at her directly. "We left a seat empty at the table. For you, for Ghostwriter. Because it felt wrong to celebrate being alive without acknowledging the person who made it possible." Emily's face went very still. "We did it every year after that," Bennett said. "Some years all 14 of us, some years fewer as people moved, and schedules made it harder. But the seat was always there." He stopped. "I don't know if knowing that changes anything for you." Emily was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but had something in it that had not been there all day. Something that was working to stay level. "It changes everything," she said. "And nothing. And I can't—" She stopped. She tried again. "I made a choice that night because it was the correct choice. Because the alternative was not something I could live with. And the fact that I'm here talking to you instead of the alternative being what happened, that's enough. It has always been enough." She paused. "But knowing that you left a place at the table—" She stopped again. Pressed her lips together once. "I didn't know anyone had done that." "Now you know," Bennett said. She nodded. It was a short private nod, the gesture of someone accepting something they needed to accept alone. "How's Claire?" she asked. Her voice had returned to its usual register. Bennett's expression shifted into something that was entirely off-duty and entirely real. "She's 14, and she thinks she knows everything, and she's probably right about 70% of the time, which is more unsettling than if she were wrong." He paused. "She wants to fly. She told me 2 months ago. She's been looking at flight academies. Emily looked at him. Something moved across her expression that might, with charitable interpretation, have been called a smile. She'll be good at it. How would you know that? Because her father spent 31 years knowing the difference between what matters and what doesn't, and that kind of knowledge doesn't sit in one generation. She picked up her flight bag more securely on her shoulder. Tell her the library has to be built from real things. Every hour has to count. She'll understand what that means when she needs to. Bennett held her gaze for a moment. I'll tell her exactly that. Reyes caught Emily at 15 minutes before she reached her truck. He came at a half run, which he was slightly embarrassed about, and slowed to a walk when he was close enough. She stopped and turned and waited for him with the same patience she had applied to everything and everyone all day. He stopped in front of her. He had a specific question, and he had spent the last 20 minutes building up to it, and now that he was here, the architecture of the build-up felt excessive. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to be honest with me, even if the honest answer is hard. Go ahead. This morning, in the briefing room, Mitchell made the joke. The whole room laughed. He looked at her steadily. I laughed. Emily waited. I want to know if I can be better than that, he said. And I want the honest answer, not the motivational one. Emily looked at him for a moment. It was the specific look of a person deciding not to manage the other person's feelings, but to answer the actual question. You already are better than that, she said. The man who laughed in the briefing room laughed because the room was laughing and it was the easy thing to do. The man standing in front of me right now ran across a parking area to ask himself an uncomfortable question in front of someone he has no reason to impress. She paused. Those aren't the same person. Same body, different version. Reyes absorbed this. The version in the briefing room is going to show up again, he said. That's the honest thing. He'll show up when I'm tired, or when the room is laughing again, or when it's easier to go with the current than against it. Yes, Emily said. He will. So what do I do? She looked at him with the measured patience of someone who has thought about this for a long time. You notice when he shows up, she said. You don't have to be perfect. You have to be paying attention. When the room laughs and you feel yourself about to join it, you stop. 1 second. You ask yourself, is this true? Is this kind? Is this worth the person it costs? She paused. Most of the time you'll stop. Sometimes you won't. But the noticing becomes the practice, and the practice becomes the person. Reyes was quiet for a moment. You've had this conversation before, he said. With myself, Emily said. Many times. He stood with that. You made mistakes too. Ooh. Of a different kind. More often the mistake of silence when speech was needed. The mistake of letting people believe the wrong thing about a situation because correcting them required more exposure than I was willing to accept. She paused. Pride operates in both directions. Arrogance and excessive humility are both forms of pride. One makes you too visible. The other makes you invisible when visibility is what the situation needs. Reyes thought about Devers on the radio. He thought about how Emily had picked up the secondary frequency handset, without hesitation, without checking whether someone else was handling it, without waiting for authorization or position or the correct hierarchy to assert itself. She had simply been the person with the capability, and she had used it. You didn't wait today, he said. During the emergency, you didn't wait for someone to tell you to act. No. Why? Because Devers needed the next correct input in the next 10 seconds, and I had it, she said simply. The hierarchy was slower than the situation. The situation didn't care about the hierarchy. Reyes filed that. He filed it carefully in a place he intended to be able to find it. Thank you, he said. He meant it specifically and fully. Emily picked up her flight bag. You're going to be good at this, she said. The flying and the rest of it. You're already paying attention in the right direction. She looked at him one more time. Don't let the ranking be the thing. Let the flying be the thing. The ranking will follow or it won't, and in the end it doesn't matter as much as whether you brought people home." She walked toward the parking area. Reyes stood where she left him and watched her go, and Torres was the last one. He didn't plan it. He was doing equipment inventory near the northern edge of the flight line when he saw Emily's pickup truck parked at the civilian lot and realized she was moving toward it. He wasn't sure what made him move in that direction. He told himself later it was because he had a question. The more honest answer was that he wasn't ready for the day to be over. He reached the edge of the lot just as she was putting her flight bag in the truck bed. "Ma'am?" She turned. He stood at the edge of the lot with his hands at his sides. He was aware that he was a 20-year-old airman and she was whoever she was, and the gap between those things was significant. But she had used his name in the briefing room and told him the spill didn't matter, and those two things had opened a small door that he was now standing at. "I just wanted to say—" He started and then wasn't sure what came next. "Today was the reason I'm here," he said finally. "What I saw today. That's the reason I wanted to do this. This job. This place." He stopped. "I don't have the words for it exactly, but I wanted to say it." Emily looked at him for a moment. "You're going to be fine, Torres," she said. "How do you know?" "Because you noticed what mattered today," she said. "Not the aircraft, not the maneuvers. What you're describing, the reason you came here, that's not about performance. That's about something underneath the performance. The people who last in this work are the ones who can find that thing underneath and hold on to it when everything on the surface gets hard." Torres thought about his grandfather on the packed dirt of an Arizona field, watching light move across a sky. "My grandfather used to say the planes weren't the point," he said. "The point was the people inside them." Emily looked at him steadily. "Your grandfather was right," she said. She got in the truck. Torres stepped back. She started the engine, the old pickup with its honest mechanical sound, nothing like the aircraft she'd been flying, and put it in gear. She paused at the edge of the lot. Her window was down. She looked back at Torres, who was standing where she'd left him. "Torres." "Ma'am?" "The coffee. I meant it. It's done. Let it go." He almost laughed. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She drove. He watched the truck move toward the base exit. He watched it until it was out of sight. Then he stood in the quiet of the emptying lot and thought about the day that had just happened, the way days occasionally happen, that reorganize something fundamental in the people who are present for them. At 1700, Harlan held the final all-hands post-event stand-down in the operations room. Standard procedure. Schedule confirmed equipment status, personnel accounting. He ran through it efficiently, the way he ran everything. At the end, he set down his clipboard. "I want to say one thing that is not in the protocol," he said. The room gave him its attention. What happened on this flight line today? All of it. Not just the incident, all of it from morning brief to final debrief was a clinic for every person in this room. He looked around at the faces, pilots, ground crew, operations staff, everyone who had been in the orbit of this day. What we saw was what this work actually looks like when it's been distilled down to its essence, when everything non-essential has been removed. He paused. "I want you to remember it, not the details, the principle. Remember what it felt like to be in the presence of someone who had nothing left to prove and therefore nothing to perform. That is the target, for all of us." He picked up his clipboard again. Dismissed. The room moved toward the door. Mitchell was among the last to leave. He stopped beside Harlan at the door. "The authorization for her slot," Mitchell said. "The person at group level who flew with her." Harlan looked at him. "Who was it?" Harlan studied him for a moment. "That's not information I'm in a position to share, Captain." "Would I know the name?" Harlan paused. Something moved through his expression. "You would know the name," he said carefully, "because it's on a plaque in the main corridor of the Academy's flight building, endowed chair, contributed by an anonymous donor in 2019. Mitchell went still. He knew that plaque. He had walked past it dozens of times. He had read the name on it without it meaning more than names on plaques usually mean to people who pass them daily. He flew with her, Mitchell said. He was her wingman, Harlan said. On the Corridor mission and on 7 others before it. He pulled out when the protocol required it. She didn't. He paused. He spent 15 years trying to do something for her that she would accept. Anonymous scholarships, training fund contributions, all of it declined or redirected. This was the first thing she didn't refuse. One day on a flight line, Mitchell said. One day on a flight line. Flying a restored aircraft for a civilian crowd. Harlan looked at him. It was enough. For her, it was completely enough. Mitchell walked out of the operations room. He stood on the apron in the late afternoon and looked at the sky. It was the same sky that had been there this morning. Same physical fact. But the way he was looking at it was different, and he understood with the particular clarity of a day that teaches you something you didn't know you were ready to learn, that the difference would not go away when he woke up tomorrow. He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the small card he always carried, the one with his personal best times. His commendation dates the metrics he'd been using as a measuring stick for a decade. He looked at it for a moment. He put it back in his pocket. Not because the numbers didn't matter, they did, but because he now understood they were only the beginning of what mattered, and he had spent too long treating them as the end. Across the empty apron, the restored Sabre sat in its hardstand, silent. Now its engine cold, the canopy closed. It had done what it came here to do. So had the woman who flew it, and the ghost of Falcon Ridge, the one nobody had been able to find for 15 years, who showed up on a Tuesday morning in an old pickup truck with a worn leather bag, who sat in a corner and listened, who knew a 6 stabilizer by the feel of her hand, who brought a young pilot down safely with 3 inputs and a calm voice, who refused thanks and declined awards and drove home in a vehicle that matched nothing else about her. She was already miles down the road. The seat at the table had been left empty for her for 15 years. She had never needed it. She had always been the reason the table existed.